I'm Carolyn Logue. I'm your contract lobbyist. My hope is next year that Max Martin, who's your new GA director, will be doing this instead of me, but you get me this year, so I'm sorry. So I just real quick, I'm going to do a quick introduction of our legislators who are here today. We wanted to make sure you had an opportunity to hear a little bit about what's happening at the legislature, particularly as it impacts small businesses, non-union and smaller contractors. We know apprenticeship is a big deal. I see Tim in the audience, so I know he's ready and to go. We have some questions we're going to ask. So we're going to start off just with, we have another Senator Saldaña, who's going to be coming in at some point, hopefully around 11:30. So at that point, we'll let her do her little quick introduction. So I think just to start, I will start off with just, the person closest to my right now is Senator JT Wilcox from the 2nd Legislative District. Wilcox Farms, you've had all their eggs. They got rid of their chocolate milk, which was a depressing occurrence. But just a real good, strong business supporter in the legislature. Up until about 2 months ago, was the House Minority Leader, should have been House Majority Leader. Should have been Speaker. Got my leadership. Anyhow, so should have been in charge, but wasn't. But we're going to try and hopefully get somebody else in charge from that end. But right now, what we have is a really good business person there too. On his right is another really good, strong business supporter in the legislature, Senator Braun, who's from the 20th Legislative District down in the Chehalis area. Senator Braun owns a kind of ambulance manufacturing business, so understands business, understands employees, understands L&I. You guys know what L&I is? Yeah, you know the difference. They know the difference between workers' comp and unemployment insurance, which, trust me, is unique in the legislature. They know about prevailing wage. They know about apprenticeship. And so with that, maybe just a couple minutes just to kind of say what you'd like to say to a group of small contractors who are fighting out there every day trying to do good work in Washington State.
Well, first of all, I want you to know you're well represented. Carolyn is a pro. I've known her for a long time, even before I was elected, because we both have roots in the grocery industry as well. And I spent some time with Max. I know his family, and I think he made a real good choice with him as well. I really appreciate ABC. You were one of my first supporters when I ran against 14-year incumbent 13 years ago. You had at that time a legend working with you, and he retired. And like I said, you made a great choice there. We are all part of a endangered species in Washington. Independent business people, people that sign checks, people that are part of the economy that isn't totally dependent on the government. And I appreciate the fact that you're toughing it out. We have still a relatively good economy, and so we haven't fallen into the recession that I think we feared when COVID started, and that we feared when interest rates started going up. But I'm sure that that's going to affect us at some point soon, and maybe some of you are feeling the impact of that already. That's something that if you go in and talk to the legislature, you're not going to find much understanding, because most people that serve in the legislature are not dependent on the economy. They're dependent on some variety of the public sector rather than the private sector. And unfortunately, even in the Republican caucuses, we don't have as many people as you would imagine that have spent most of their lives in the private sector. And I think there's a couple of things that are responsible for that. First of all, public sector or nonprofits tend to be a lot more willing to let people take 2 to 6 months off and make it very easy financially for them to be legislators. And the other thing that I think happens is the public sector and nonprofits see a big value in having people from their organizations serve in the legislature and in other areas of politics. And then the other thing that happens, I think the private sector has done a really poor job of recognizing that they have to support people that are going to represent them in the legislature. It used to be full of people from Boeing, for example. It's been 6 or 8 years since we've had somebody that had worked at Boeing serve in my caucus. At least I think the same is true in the Senate. And so it's not as, we don't have as much private sector representation in the Republican caucuses as we should, and we have almost zero in the Democratic caucuses. And this is a problem. Not only do you have kind of a lack of commitment to the private sector and the private economy, you have just a shocking lack of understanding of the basics, not only of economics, but of what do you do every day when you are an owner or a manager of a small business or a large business. I think there's another prejudice that is a little bit of a challenge for all of that, and that's that big government likes big organizations. They would much rather do a deal with a handful of the biggest companies in the world that are headquartered in Washington. It's probably a good thing for us, than have to deal with the messy reality of the smaller scale parts of the private economy. And that means that all of you, I think, are very aware that you're operating at a disadvantage. You need people that understand what you do, and you need to be willing to put the extra time into going to the legislature and explain what you do to people that have almost no common frame of reference with you. I guess this sounds a little depressing, but I want you to know what Carolyn has to deal with every day.
Senator Braun, who I neglected to mention, is the Senate Minority Leader for the Republicans. And I also neglected to mention both these gentlemen are serving currently on the labor, basically what would be the Labor and Commerce Committees for the respective bodies. Senator Braun, you should also be Majority Leader. If I had
a few more people to
a magic wand, I would advance this. Anyhow, Senator Braun, do you have any words?
Yeah, sure. So John Braun, I represent the 20th Legislative District, which is down in Southwest Washington. So just south of Olympia to just north of Vancouver. It used to be Willapa Hills. Now we've moved to I-5 out to White Pass, a big rural district. I've been in the legislature for this is my 11th year. And in my day job, I run a manufacturing business. We build specialty emergency vehicles, ambulances, rescue vehicles, command vehicles, that type of thing. So thanks for having me here. I'll second JT's comment. This organization has chosen well in the past and currently in terms of representation in Olympia, and I think it matters. This is an organization I've always been able to count on to stand up for business in a very clear-headed and sometimes pointed way, where you sometimes get business organizations, especially organizations that are dominated by large businesses that, they feel the need to kind of go along to feel like they're relevant. And that's not, in my view, not the right answer. You need to be very clear, and I think you are, on the things that are really affecting your businesses, because they don't just affect you. They certainly do affect you, but they also affect your employees, they affect your customers, and ultimately they affect our state. One thing we sometimes don't fully appreciate is just how important businesses like yours are to our state. You should recognize that value and stand up for the opportunity to succeed in Washington. And just like JT was saying, you have your challenge, some challenges cut out for you. We have real problems with the direction of our state in terms of budgeting, in terms of regulation, in terms of restricting your ability to do good work for yourselves, for your employees, for your community, for your customers, because the state wants to get involved and tell you how you should do it. And generally, they're not very good at it. It is the bottom line. So I'm not going to, it's nice for me because JT often makes me go first. We often, when we were both, when he was in the leadership role, we often ended up at the same place together. He would always get me to go first. So I got to talk a lot, and he got to kind of, get by, but not get by, but but this time he went first. And he did a great job. So I'm not going to say a lot more other than there are real challenges out there, and you need to keep it up and explaining how they affect you. There's not deep knowledge within the legislature of how you deal with employment security, how you deal with labor and industries, how you deal with all the regulation that our state places on you. And it runs a full gamut from from building regulation to, regulation on your employees, to regulation on how you manage your facilities, to your transportation. It just goes on. And the sheer volume of stuff that you have to comply with to stay out of trouble and still try to make ends meet is very daunting. So don't give up. There's still a number of fans in the legislature. We're with you. We just you need to show up and continue to share your story, share your challenges, and press us to do the right thing to help you be successful.
Okay. Senator Saldaña, welcome. We were just doing a little quick intro, just kind of, and then I'll just ask you to tell this is all, contractors, small business, and then talking a little bit about what you would want to say to a group like this about actions in the legislature and sort of what's happening, just in a couple minutes, and then we have questions that we're going to be asking. All right. So Senator Saldaña represents the 37th legislative district, which is that way. I think it's that way. It's that way. And is the vice chair of Senate Labor and Workforce, or Labor and Commerce. It's Labor and Commerce in the Senate. It's Labor and Workplace Standards in the House. So forgive me, I've gotten to an age where I forget it. They change their names so often. So anyhow, so if you just want to tell the group a few things about yourself and what you want them to know about what you would like to convey.
All right, well, thank you. I see a few familiar faces from Zoom, so nice to see you here in real life. And I represent South Seattle, International Chinatown Central District. We have the light rail first went through my district at street level, which has pros and cons to it. And we have a lot of development going up in my community of mixed use projects. Some are, residential, but a lot of residentials now in 5/2, and other kinds of infill projects. A lot of cleanup projects. A lot of the land that's available needs mitigation in order to be able to build on it again. So Healthy Homes is a Department of Ecology program that we've been actively supporting to make sure that we can build more homes. And also, of course, was Vice Chair of Transportation when we did the overhead package, which is taking climate revenues and investing them in our infrastructure to make sure we have climate resilient transportation and right of ways for the next generation. So that has been a big part of our work. And as we do that, of course, you guys are at the front line of making sure that we can electrify as one of the many ways that we have a more resilient, independent grid for powering our economy. And so I just want to thank you first and foremost for choosing this career. And I know that as owners and employers that and workforce yourself, that there are challenges with working through regulation. But I come, in terms of where I come from, I come from a family that have been workers. So as many owners, and now my brothers do own businesses, but my dad was a farm worker in segregated Southern Texas in the 50s. He came up to the Northwest to be able to, and found here opportunity. First of all, to be just treated as a human being. And through that work, he moved into factory work, and he was a machinist. And he worked at a factory in Georgetown where there was a union. And it really did make a difference for my family's life as someone that he didn't have an opportunity to go through high school. He was working since he was a child. And so that gave him an opportunity for training, education, knowing his rights. He became a leader, he became a steward, and he was able to retire early with a pension. And that is rare for a lot of folks. And so part of my work in the legislature has really been about how do we modernize the state to be able to be a better partner so that whether you're an employer, whether you're an independent contractor, or whether you're just a general worker, that you are able to provide for your family, that your work is supported, that you have dignity in your workplace, that you can access leave to be able to take care of your family when you need to, and that you have an opportunity to eventually retire with some kind of dignity. And so it's not easy when we're creating that out of nothing, because a lot of workforce, a lot of folks are excluded from the American dream. And, it's my job, I feel like, to try to figure out how do we create an opportunity for people of our generation that don't work in one place. They work 7 jobs over, on average. And it just doesn't look the same for the generation before us in the legislature. And I gotta call the electricians, as you guys know, and we're at different sides, I would say, right? And create to get that registered apprenticeship. So it's bumpy, but I do think that the legislation we put forward at least make sure that we are capturing as many as we meant to initially, and we created yet another opportunity to be able to get those hours. And I know that we'll be actively engaged on implementation to make sure that we are able to have the workforce that you need to be able to do your job. Okay.
So with that, we've put together, I think you all got a copy of these questions, so Adam's gonna ask the questions, and so hopefully, and then we'll kind of be looking, so just everybody else knows, if there's a follow-up, I'm gonna be looking for people to do follow-up questions. I do ask for everybody to be respectful, you guys and you guys, because we're gonna probably be on the opposite sides of some things. But I think the reality is it's a great opportunity to have these conversations, to hear what's being said, and to really get to know legislators, because you really need to get to know your legislators, regardless of what party they're from and regardless of where they are on the issue, so you can have these open conversations. I don't know if any of you would disagree with this, but no policy ever sticks if it's done on a partisan basis. If all the parties are talking and everybody gets together, it sticks and it works, or at least works better than if you just try to jam something through. So what I'd like to do is have Adam start with the questions, and we'll give everybody an opportunity to answer them, and I'll sort of alternate who gets to go first as moderator, since I have control. And then kind of see where we are and then see what we can do with follow-ups and just try to make sure we're out of here in time, because I think lunch smells really good over there, so.
Thank you
All
so
right,
much.
go ahead.
Thank you again all for being here. I appreciate it. Adam Kemley, Kemley Electric, small electrical contractor out of Ballard in Seattle there. So first question we have is, what do you see as the most important recent legislative developments that directly or indirectly affect small businesses or contractors?
Okay, may I put Senator Braun on the spot for this one?
Sure, so, yeah, I think if you think about this, the session we just got through, I go kind of big picture. I think the most important thing that happened for the business community, and thankfully for all citizens, was the budget itself. Not the budget I would have written, myself or Republicans would have written, I wouldn't call it a bipartisan budget, but there's some structural impact that Republicans were included in, and it helped with. So you got a budget that grows by less than half of the rate of growth that we've seen over the last 3 bienniums. So we've been growing at 19% plus per biennium, well above inflation, well above growth in personal income. And this budget grows by about 8%. And the reason I bring that up, it sounds really in the weeds, right? But that means long-term, there's hopefully going to be less demand for additional taxes. And I think that is probably the biggest impact, certainly one of the biggest impacts that the state has, particularly on small businesses. We were able to hold back all of the general tax increases. There was a push towards the end of session for a significant property tax increase, and also a potentially significant real estate excise tax increase that I think would have hurt our communities, hurt our economy, and hurt small businesses in particular. So big picture, I think that's the most important win. If you want to think about wins for the session, I think that's the most important win for small business.
Okay, Senator Saldaña, like you asked.
Yeah, I think partly is the budgets, right? I mean, the fact that we are creating opportunities for work and the infrastructure investments that we're making, both on the capital side and on the operating transportation side, I think are super significant, especially for the electrical workforce and for independent contractors. So I think there's also investments in the Office of Minority and Women Business in terms of kind of growing that, building a pipeline, helping people that want to stay small, but those that want to grow, creating those opportunities to be able to scale up, to be able to meet bigger demand.
Representative Wilcox.
Okay, I guess I'm gonna take the pessimistic side here. And I think that there this year it seemed like there was more difference between the House and the Senate than there normally has been. The Senate was more collegial. I think there was a lot more effective exchange of ideas than there were in the House. But I would say that there's two things that really worry me. First, it has to do with the idea that not only do you have to pass laws, but you have to be able to execute on a plan. And that competency of government is important. And I started my job when Governor Gregoire was here. And, we talked about how awful she was. But the truth is, I haven't known very many people that were more committed to implementing ideas and programs successfully and competently than Chris Gregoire. And I don't see that with our current governor. I've got this thing that I say sometimes that isn't meant to be disrespectful, but sometimes people laugh at it. I used to think that he was single-minded about the environment and carbon, and then during COVID, I found out that he's just single-minded, and that doesn't mean that I'm insulting him. I think he usually likes to prioritize one thing at a time, and it certainly hasn't been the ferry system, certainly hasn't been the Department of L&I. Mostly it's been carbon, and at times it's been other things. And so the idea that government is here not just to be ideological and to pass, a single agenda, but to actually provide services in the most competent possible way is a problem. And I really, really quarrel with the way the House in particular has decided that they're almost never going to take on the governor in terms of oversight. I think that's a dereliction of duty. I also served with Frank Chop for a long time. And I think Frank Chop really, really cared about vetting legislation so that it would do what it was intended to do. Now, it may be that Frank is Machiavellian enough that his intent wasn't exactly what the legislation looked like, but I'm pretty sure that he was in his lair back there, really reviewing legislation, and he wanted to have a coherent program. And that takes me to the second thing that I want to critique a little bit, and that is that I don't think that we're approaching a lot of our legislation with a strategy, and especially when it comes to the world of building, and especially the world of housing. We have this grab bag of things that are designed to help housing. And that was actually a pretty bipartisan approach this year. Republicans and Democrats in the House and Senate worked together to pass some things that actually roll back a little bit of regulation and will make it more likely that we can build housing. It's about a decade too late, and a lot of people have had to suffer because of that. But there was good progress there. And then at the same time, I say we because I'm part of the legislature, but I didn't vote for these things. There were also a number of things passed that seemed to just roll it right back and make the planning process much more complicated because we added a bunch of elements. And anyone that, has reached a certain age, I think understands that the more priorities you have, the less progress you make. And so if we're trying to create housing for people, adding a bunch of elements is not going to help you create that progress. And then I think something that has affected a lot of you is this, very single-minded war on carbon that says, look, we just hate carbon. We don't like petroleum-based products. So we're not going to let you put any of those things in, regardless of any other factor, regardless of cost, regardless of whether or not we have the electrical capacity available. We just don't like carbon. I think is a disaster in the making, and it's a sign that we don't have a comprehensive strategy.
Okay. Next question. Thank you.
Skip, or just in the interest of time, a little bit on some of the questions. Is that all right?
Yeah,
great.
Say as much as.
So this one kind of goes back to the apprenticeship, and what do you all think is the future of apprenticeship, particularly the oversight and approval of apprenticeship programs as we move apprenticeship beyond the traditional construction industries or trades?
This time, Senator Saldaña gets to go first.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think with apprenticeship, I mean, there's just so much that we don't have actually, I think where there's a lot of creativity, and then go back and look at some of the traditional registered apprenticeships that we have, of what can we learn from the ones where we don't have it yet. So in healthcare, you know, how are we doing, you know, pay to work? You know, and I think there was some things this year in terms of even recognizing that when high school students have to work, like there is a value of, you know, that they can apply to their education and get some credit for that. And so I think the more that we're doing outside and hands-on, you know, integrated learning, and being able to have that add up to careers and opportunities, I think is the way forward. So that's more behavioral health, you know, where we've created some of those opportunities in healthcare. And then I think with ours, with building trades, where there's been a long history of those apprenticeships. I mean, I do think that there's still conversations to be had about how do we make sure that the council is representative of the different work, you know, types of businesses and also labor. That I think is, you know, something for us to be able to look forward to in the future. But yeah, I think the more that we get people outside of the traditional classroom, the more likely they're going to be able to.
All right, Representative Wilcox.
Okay, I will be briefer this time. You know, we've got this moment in time where all of a sudden the things that you do are popular and important. You know, we also, I think, are very focused on the fact that although we've got workforce problems all over the economy, some of the most critical are in the part of the economy that you work in. So everybody supports the idea that we have to have more capacity for training. In your world, that's mostly called apprenticeships. And I think we've also overcome this idea that the only route to success for young people is a four-year university. And that's going to cause a lot of pain in the four-year university world. I think they're going to figure out what a recession looks like. But what we, I think, have to do is make sure that we don't destroy the opportunity by trying to accomplish too many different things as we create a larger and a younger workforce for your industry. And by that, I mean, there's two things that I think are critical. We have to increase our capacity to build housing, and that's not going to happen overnight. It's going to be a long, long boom. And to do that, we have to increase our capacity to train mostly young people, but not all young people. We will screw that up if we try to accomplish a whole bunch of other things at the same time, because the more priorities you have, the less you accomplish. If we do those two things, if we increase the supply of housing, and as we do that, we vastly increase our capacity to train people to enter those fields, we will accomplish a whole bunch of great social goals at the same time. They will happen because we did those two things right. That's what we should concentrate on. And you, I think, should work hard on partnerships with unions as well, because you have a ton in common here to make sure that we approach this in the simplest and most effective possible way.
Senator Braun.
Well, thank you. So I think, Mr. Apprenticeships, we have both, I think, tremendous opportunity and tremendous challenges in front of us. Opportunity in the sense that more and more recognition of the value of apprenticeships as a very effective way for folks to get education, hands-on education, and more academic education. As a society, we recognize that there's demand for the types of work like this organization does that has historically relied on apprenticeships to get trained workers. So the market is there for that. These are all good things, I think, and will lead to more opportunity for more people long term. The challenges are, we are not, in my view, doing a particularly good job in our state in building out apprenticeship programs. We have somewhat of a partisan divide. We have problems with representation on the council for approval. We have sort of protectionism, I would call it, by some groups. And I think it's doing all of us harm. And I think it's not obvious to me that we're going to break through this politically. In my mind, it's the way it plays out. And I don't think this is the best way for it to play out, but that's how it's playing out right now. It's the innovative, dynamic Washington and U.S. workforce trying to figure out a way around the regulatory roadblocks that we keep throwing in your way when it comes to training. That's true more broadly, but specifically for training. In some places, like, in like all my experiences in manufacturing, they just won't wait. I'm like, no, I'm not going to wait on the apprenticeship problem because the state's standing in our way. I know better than the state how to train our folks to do the job and do it well and do it safely and so I'm not going to wait on them. So unless they stop me with regulation, I'm just going to go do the job and just stay out of my way. I think in particular with electrical, with some of the building codes, it's harder to do that because the state keeps stepping in the way. And I think it's a contest. Can you innovate and get at the work, in other ways faster than we can regulate you from stopping it? And it shouldn't be that way. It should be us helping create an environment where you can, build programs, you can train your workers to do a good job. And I don't think we're there right now. We're just not. And we disagree. Senator Saldaña and I disagree on many aspects of this. I think it's doing great harm to our state and to or folks in this organization in particular, in terms of your ability to recruit, train, retain, and build, people and build your companies, your organizations. And most importantly, that's hurting the general population because it's making your work more expensive and therefore their costs higher and Washington more difficult to live in.
Kind of along that same vein, we're here on a safety day, and apprenticeship program, part of that is being safer, and education is a huge part of safety. Has there been any discussion of moving apprenticeship policy away from the traditional labor arena and more into the education arena?
Wilcox, you get to start this one.
Well, I have not served on policy committees for a long time. It's been 11 years, I think. So if those have happened, they haven't risen to the level of leadership in at least in the House Republican caucus. And I guess I would be very cautious about that. We have a higher ed committee. That's where good ideas go to die. A lot of times it seems like that's the committee where there's constant conversation about how many angels can dance on the head of a pin. And I just don't see that as an arena that accomplishes much. I absolutely get the frustration that you have with the various agencies that deal with labor. I'm a recovering CFO, and at one point actually had a self-insurance pool at Wilcox Farms where we had about 500 people involved. So I've been around that a lot, but man, going into the higher ed realm, I would question.
Senator Braun, you're next.
Yeah, I'm with JT on this. I couldn't, and I have tons of frustration with this policy as it is being considered in the Senate, Labor and Commerce. I think we're getting it wrong often. But I mean, higher ed, and I've been a big supporter of higher ed throughout my legislative career, but they're a little bit lost right now. And they're getting, I think ultimately it will be a good thing. They're getting a ton of pressure, right? Because people, kids are choosing other paths. Almost every university in our state has an enrollment problem because there are better opportunities at a better price. So they're in a situation where they really have to rethink their model if they're delivering something of value for what it's costing to go there. So I don't know that tossing them apprenticeships would be a wise solution. I do think long-term, there's going to be a more comprehensive understanding of how we get young folks, trained in skills and out into the workforce in a way they can be successful. But I don't know that moving to higher ed is the way to do it. The other thing I mentioned, a little different, you mentioned, you had safety somewhere in your question. And that piqued my interest because I think one of the challenges we see with apprenticeships and with workforce regulations in general is the folks who are in the business, the folks who are in control, whether they're in control of the regulatory process or they're in control of the certificating process, they have this natural inclination to say, oh, I think you need more, not less. And it's always about safety, right? Nobody in this room, there's nobody in this room, I believe, that doesn't care deeply about the safety of their employees and their customers. I don't think there's any question. We all benefit from good, safe programs. But it's also a very convenient excuse when you say, I want to add more hours, or I want to add more regulation, I want to add more barriers to doing the job. You can always say, oh, we need more safety. But we don't really quantify it. And I think that's a huge risk. Do we get more safety? The data would tell you, no, we don't. All we get is more expense, more cost, and more limitations on people who want to go do a good job. We have to be willing to say, okay, we care about safety, but there's a point where this is no longer about safety. This is about restricting people from doing the job they want to do by adding more regulations to their employment, whether you want to be a barber or electrician. Why do we stand in the way and use safety as an excuse when it's not about more safety, it's about more restriction? This isn't just limited to this type of work this organization does. It's more broad, and in that sense, I think there's a little bit of room for hope. I was at, I think maybe JP and I were both at a couple events in January prior to the session where I heard the speaker talk about her concern with workforce development and her concern about over-regulating entry into different professions or locations. And that's something we agree on. We see states across the country pulling back on regulatory requirements and educational requirements for people to enter certain types of vocations. And I think that's encouraging. I think we got a big problem. I think it's very convenient to use safety as an excuse. I think people are starting to understand, and it's part of the broader shift societally is that we don't need some of the organizations we built to funnel our workforce have got off the path a little bit and aren't doing the job they were intended to do, or at least not doing it as efficiently as we need them to do it.
Senator Saldaña.
Yeah, and I was gonna say, I think there's places where we agree. And I think part of it is, looking at, where can we remove barriers? And I think part of that was looking at permits, looking at, some of the things that when you look at the overall cost, right? Labor is a big piece of it, and education and safety, protocols. But a lot of it is, places where we also are government, that if we can figure out how do we, show up in a better way, whether it's around permitting, and to me, around the elements, I'll just have to go back to planning. If we spend more time upfront planning and incorporating all the components that make this not only just whatever you're building safe, but also helps meet the needs so that we don't have to go back in there and then do a bunch of mitigation. That does save dollars overall, even though it's more costly upfront, right? And so I think what I want to say around education is, I think that there are ways that we can leverage the resource that is the public lands of these community colleges, technical colleges, four-year colleges, to be able to administer and make the apprenticeship more accessible, no matter where you are in the state of Washington. And so, I live in South Seattle. The Georgetown Seattle College campus is basically all apprenticeships and building trades, education. So I do think rather than having to put it on your private property or, find another place where you're building something, how we use our community college network to be a place where we can do remote learning. So rather than having to go and travel to some destination, which I know is something that I've heard a lot from folks, is how can you have that in your own community where it's accessible to them, so they're not having to drive an hour? Why couldn't they use that college and then have the one instructor come to them if you have X amount of, staff. So if there's a group of small contractors and you pull your resources for a day of training and, and you have 15 staff between two contractors, why not do that where it's closer to you? I think there is ways, there are ways that we can leverage that. That's a public resource. That is our taxpayer dollars being used. And if it's not benefiting you, like there should be ways for us to do that. I know the other piece of Seattle College, Central College with our wood tech, and just trying to figure out these. I think there's also opportunities for us to work on the difference between residential. So O1 is what we were all working on, but we also know that there's O2, O3, and that a lot of independent contractors have really focused a lot of their work in more traditional residential. And as residential, especially in urban areas like mine, and even in other, small towns and cities across where we're doing more of that infill, where we end up with these mixes, is how do we make sure that, you're able to have your trainee, but also your apprentice, if you have a mix, right? And that's something that we've been thinking about and trying to figure out, like how whether it felt like it didn't need to be regulated at an RCW level, but definitely, as we're looking at implementation, making sure that it actually makes sense for each workforce, I think is really important. And so I think there's places there as well where we're doing subcontracting, or whether you're the prime contractor or you're the subcontractor, is making sure that we're creating more flexibility around how we're working together, as long as we're getting those outcomes of safety and we're getting those outcomes of the product and helping people get their their careers. Because that's the big thing, is making sure they get enough hours in a timely way to be able to get to that training level.
I think we're kind of out of time. So I think hopefully, I know that Max and Adam and Wendy have something to talk to you guys about real quick, kind of back in one of the conference rooms while everyone's going to lunch. But hopefully you can mill around at lunch a little bit and talk to people and get a chance to meet before you take off. So hopefully there's a few opportunities. Does that work for everybody? I'd love to open it up. I mean, we could probably sit here for about 3 hours. I mean, these chairs aren't the most comfortable. So anyhow, so I appreciate all of your answers. Adam, I feel like.
Thank you so much
Yeah.
for being here and taking the time to join us on our safety day. And we really appreciate you all and your comments and your insights.
And we will be